So as some of you may know, Marathon just released its biggest art drop. So today we're going to go through some of the art that's been posted. I'll be giving you my thoughts and analysis along the way, and we'll also be trying to decipher the intricacies of Marathon's art direction. Before we get started, leave a like and subscribe for more art and concept art content, but without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so first of all, a lot of what I know about Marathon's art direction comes from Jake the Allright's video on Marathon's art style. It's a really quick 15-minute video, so if you want to learn more about the philosophies behind Marathon's art direction, I highly recommend going to check that one out. The very condensed summary of the Marathon art style is something that Bungie calls graphic realism, which simplifies the universal design language of the world into strong graphic color statements, as well as limited materials. This visual language, combined with believable proportions, believable scale, and implied function and detail, creates the very stylized but believable world of Marathon. In order to better understand this thought process, I'll start with some weapon designs, which I feel like are probably more accessible than characters or environments, which tend to be a little bit more complex. And here are some of the guns posted by Patrick Bloom, an artist that we'll be speaking a lot about today. So go check out his work. As usual, I have every single artist's links in the description below. But what an innovative take to weapon design, right? Obviously, silhouette-wise, this is very similar to the scout rifles that we've seen in Destiny. And therein lies some of the secret to Marathon's art style and why it's so weird and abstract, but still grounded and believable, which is this careful adherence to recognizable silhouette and implied functionality. When it comes to prop and weapon design, something that is talked a lot about and focused on is this idea of anchor points. There might be different names for it, which really just means any functional prop, right? Any vehicle, any weapon, boils down to a few core areas that allow the audience to recognize the object's mechanisms and purpose. A box on its own is abstract, but a box with four wheels all of a sudden becomes a vehicle, right? So it's these areas of communication that we really want to focus on. For a gun, this main anchor point is always going to be the weapon handle and trigger, which means no matter how you stylize and how you abstract areas of design in other parts of the weapon, the trigger and handle have to remain recognizable in order for the audience to believe at a first read that this object is a functional weapon. So, as we look at all of these guns and props and characters for Marathon here, keep an eye out for these silhouettes and anchor points, right? And I think we'll find that a lot of Marathon's strongest design are found in these areas. This pistol design is really nice as well. You can tell how much thinking there is in simplifying the silhouette of the weapon, of the gun, in every single area except for the anchor point, right? Which once again is our handle and our trigger. The rest of the prop really just becomes a box. We see our big, medium, small relationships work its way into every part of the design as well, which is always a huge part of organizing and simplifying a somewhat complex read. I love how primitive all of these mechanisms are while remaining so believable. And I think areas like this, where the sight is attached through this side panel instead of just being attached to the top of the weapon, really shows how much thinking there is in the mechanisms and functionality of these props. Here's another amazing pistol design. Once again, right, reserving all of our complexity and all of our design thinking for our anchor point, and everywhere else sort of just becomes a simplified silhouette, which is really supported by these moments of graphic design that decorate our weapon, right? These decals that flesh out the industrial design of the world. I'm not a graphic designer, but if there's something that you're seeing that you want to point out, please leave a comment down below. Such an innovative take on weapons. And this is really sophisticated design thinking, right? To be able to stylize to this extent, but still to have the form and the function be communicated in such an effective way. Okay, while we're still talking about Patrick Bloom's work, let's take a look at some of the work that he did for the characters. So Patrick was responsible for the thief character, and I really appreciate that he's posted his entire process here of going from his early sketches to the final design. So what are we focusing on throughout the process? Okay, well, clearly high fashion is one of our thematic priorities. These characters look like they came straight off the runway. We see another batch of sketches here for the thief character, where we are a bit further away from the high fashion idea and we're leading more into the sleek operative look. And as we continue our thinking, I think this conceptual contrast of high fashion and thief actually come together really well. I mean, it's almost like a Catwoman-y femme fatale kind of an approach, which, along with all of this mobility that's been designed into the sleek lower body, I think pretty effectively communicates her role and function. These portrait designs remind me a lot of Alberto Mielgo's work, which, the graphic nature of his portfolio probably became one of the inspirations for a lot of the stuff that Bungie did with Marathon as well. I really love this knee joint design. The goal is clearly to simplify, right? There's not a lot of mechanisms or joints. And Thief begins to feel almost like an action figure, which I think is really cool. This final design pass is such a clear indication of their design inspirations and their design goals. We achieve our high fashion visual theme through our techie jacket, and we see how much of a focus there is on creating these connected graphic shapes throughout the entire character. These moments of asymmetry are working really well, and even though the majority of our color palette is so monochromatic, these little pops of saturated color really help the design to not feel very static. We also see some early explorations for the Destroyer shell here. These early sketches are always the funnest part about looking at character designs. They remind me a lot of Ryan DeMita's work, with a similar sort of bold contrast and line weight. These early versions of Destroyer look really cool. There's a really clear military focus here with the way that our costume is constructed, as well as the organization of our prop placements. Even the helmet as well. I think there's been a lot of research into military helmets. But while the thematic design is really strong here, I'm speculating that maybe this initial pass didn't have the tankiness that Bungie was looking for. Patrick Bloom also did some supporting concept work for the original ideas for the Triage shell, based off of the even earlier concept sketches by Daniel Chavez. But these early iterations for Triage are pretty different from where we ended up as well. I think this concept was eventually continued by Tobias Kwan, and I love seeing all the little different design choices and iterations and layers that comes from this character going through all these different artists' hands. It's one of the best things about concepts, right, as opposed to other art forms, is that there's a real collaborative aspect to the creation process. Whether or not you're working with other teams or other artists, the Triage shell here ended up with more of a mechanical look, similar to a lot of the other shells, which I think makes Thief and Vandal the only characters where we can see more natural and organic skin tones. I wonder if there's any lore implications in that decision. Marathon takes an interesting approach to character design here with their shells, utilizing ultimately a hero shooter design philosophy, right? These characters occupy different roles that have to be visually communicated, taking the TF2 approach of not giving these characters names, but instead functional callouts and call signs. The drawback to this approach is that we don't see as much personal narrative or personality expression, but it's interesting. I think this idea is almost explored in some of the animated shorts that we've seen, where these characters are having their own personal struggles with this lack of identity, which is just really sophisticated thinking and great decision making from the Bungie team here to have this hero shooter design philosophy, its strengths and its weaknesses play a role in the narrative of the world. Okay, while we're on the topic of characters, I want to move over to some of Tobias Kwan's work in designing some of the AI enemies in the game, and I'll start with the UESC troopers. It's amazing to see that even in these enemy designs, there's a lot of modularity in the thought process, and this is one of the big parts of why this graphic realism that Bungie wanted to focus on works so well, is because we're not only focusing on the visual. I feel like the language of the world exceeds that of an art style, and this minimal but functional nature extends even into the industrial world building of these characters. And I mean, this has always been one of Tobias Kwan's strengths, even since the Destiny days. There's always such a depth of thought in his concepts. It's never just, this is how this character or this object or this environment looks, but it's always how these things are constructed from the ground up and how they function. And the visual aesthetics of his designs almost seem like a byproduct of this initial world building, which is why his designs look so cool and so believable. Combine that with a tasteful graphic design of his concept presentation sheets. I mean, it's no wonder this guy stands at the forefront of the concept industry. Okay, let's move on to the elites now. Coming from the troopers, there's an obvious emphasis on creating a bulkier look, and I think it's a really efficient solution to have this third arm mechanic contribute to the boxiness of the elite's read. There's a few different callouts here for how all of this works, but something I want to make a note of here is this sheet where Tobias says, thruster blocks can be oriented differently if we need more backwards third arm articulation. Tobias is showing his experience here, and if you are a concept artist or if you're aspiring, this is definitely something to keep an eye on. A concept always has to serve production, and however cool the design might be, it's ultimately pointless if they're unable to function or to move in the way that the game needs them to. So I always love seeing sheets or callouts like this where we get a peek into the designer's thought process of how to take concept art into production. Okay, now let's look at our Assault Commander, which is, again, another step up from our elites. We get even bulkier with this design, which adds these wing shapes that turn our character into almost like a rectangle. I love how from a side, we almost even start to lose the humanoid silhouette of this character in the very abstract nature of its construction. There are so many decals on this character, and I feel like I'm missing a lot of graphic design choices, so don't hesitate to point out something that I might be missing. Let's move on now to our Assault Warden. And seeing how much bulk we can add to these modular enemies, it almost starts teetering on the edge of looking campy, but I think that was ultimately part of the goal of creating these almost wacky but also very recognizable upgrades as we progress in enemy difficulty. Especially here with the bright red color of the Warden, it really gives you a sense of imminent danger. We also have the Ghost enemy archetype, which also shares a modular, progressively bulkier design thinking as the troopers. So here we have the elites, the commanders, and then the wardens. I think the cape is a really effective choice here, and in-game, the cape helps a lot in differentiating these enemy types from the previous ones. And then lastly, we have our grenadiers, which have a boxier torso and a head that almost looks like a projector. Once again, we have our elites, our commanders, which have this really cool mounted launcher system, and then our wardens. Finally, we have the snipers, with the most slender body type out of all of our enemies so far. And they also have this really cool transformation where they enter this alternate stance, and it reminds me of like the Scions from Destiny, because they almost have like a similar bubble. We have the sniper commanders here as well, which feature this really cool transforming head that shoots out a viscous liquid bullet. These enemy designs are really innovative. There's a really confident art direction in these enemy roles as well as their upgrade system. I do think their streamlined visual language makes it difficult to read at some points when you're playing the game, but perhaps that's part of the challenge of deciphering which enemy type you're facing and how best to combat that situation. Tobias Kwan also designed the compiler, which I have no idea how the compiler works in game. I never made it that far, but I can definitely compliment its visual design. It's very evocative of the original Marathon visuals. In the design of the compiler, we move away from the boxy geometric nature of everything else in this world, which makes this being recognizably alien. We're seeing a lot of pyramid shape language, which is no surprise given that Tobias Kwan is the artist responsible for a lot of those visuals. I think it's really cool that there's a Marathon ship variant where there's this cervical implant on the nape of the compiler. I'm not too sure what this means in the lore. I'm gonna have to watch some Bife videos to understand that. But overall, Tobias Kwan is definitely flexing his muscles here with a lot of this hybrid organic-inorganic shape language. Tobias Kwan was also responsible for designing Gantry, Oni, and Gaius. But there's not a whole lot of process posted for some of these, so I'm not going to be speaking too in-depth about them. There's a few projects here that I'm going to skip over, but if you want to see everything that Tobias posted, go check out his ArtStation linked below. While we're on the topic of these faction agents, let's move over to Dima Goryainov, who has some of the most phenomenal and visually striking 3D work that I've ever seen. I'm not too familiar with the 3D side, but I still think there's a great illustrative quality to this design work. Let's start with Vulcan. There's clearly a lot of narrative and lore decisions being made in the posture and design construction of the Vulcan agent here, but even from an uneducated perspective, there's a legible, trapped, almost straitjacket look to this character's costume. Her posture is rigid and almost uncomfortable, but the line behind her is sitting so casually and resting. So I wonder what the dynamic is between these narrative elements. Like I mentioned when we looked at Jamie Jones's paintings, I think there's always an impulse for me to look for the character or the elements that have the most authority in the frame and the composition. And while the bright orange colors, as well as the throne visual read does give authority to our humanoid character here, I think her straitjacket and her bare legs do invite somewhat of a feeling of sympathy. I'm really curious about the lore here, so maybe in a part 2 I'll address these things after I do a bit more research. But for now, let's move on to Arachne. The Arachne agent is one of the visual highlights for me of this Marathon Art Blast. It's interesting, this is such a religious design, right? It's very visibly obvious that we're making a lot of religious references. I don't know if this is still a thing that's being taught, but when I went to school for production art, it was always made very clear that religion was a taboo topic. Religious references or maybe crosses were always discouraged in our projects. So it's interesting to see those elements in full display here. Now, obviously, we're making references to occultist and cult symbolism, but it still feels so naughty, I guess, to see all of these crosses something that's typically discouraged in academia. Now that we've looked at props and characters, let's finally take a look at some of the really unique environments that's been created for the Marathon world. We'll start with Patrick Bloom and then move on to some other artists and outsourced studios here. In these marsh explorations, something that I'd like to reiterate and something that I've mentioned in previous videos is this idea of conceptual contrast. I think I first mentioned this in my video on the art of Concord. When artists create concepts, a technique that they sometimes employ is this idea of conceptual contrast, which is where you take two opposing ideas or concepts and you use them to juxtapose each other and to create a dynamic character or prop or environment. In this instance, you'll notice that because our architecture in the frame is so rigid and so boxy, so geometric, and because our surrounding environment is on the complete other end with being so organic and fluid, these two opposing ideas amplify the strengths of each other's narratives. This is like putting an orange next to a blue or putting a red next to a green, right? These things amplify the strengths of each other. And there's a particularly meta layer to this where the building's saturation is a lot higher than the environment, which typically isn't something that you'd expect, right? You'd typically expect greenery and forestry to be a lot more saturated than architecture. So our conceptual contrast is at play here as well, presenting these elements in sort of an opposing design direction, which in turn amplifies the strength of this choice, right? The buildings look a lot more saturated because of this choice, and the surrounding environment looks a lot more desaturated because of this choice. I love the straightforward pathing in the scene. I'm not an environment artist, but I know that it's something that they typically look for is how well can we design the way that the player navigates the scene and traverses the environment. Something that they've definitely thought about is the fact that not only are the supports of this bridge such a strong red color, the bridge is also in a direct straight line completely in the open. And you feel this effect when you're playing where some paths feel more visually obvious, which actually makes you not want to take them, right? Because they're so out in the open and you're so vulnerable when you're taking these obvious paths. I think there's a deliberate choice here in opening up the shrubbery in our foreground to allow this alternate path that feels maybe a little bit more safe if you're thinking about the gameplay. Another artist that I've been obsessed with is Sigurd Fernström. I'm always just a really big fan of painted or drawn concepts, and within the Marathon Art Blast, Sigurd has some amazing painted pieces here. These early paintings are really fun to look at, and they actually look really close to the final product in the game. Even in such a loose painting, like in this blue composition here, there's a lot of really striking choices in the way that our character is purposefully hidden in the rhythmic shadows of this barrier. Despite that, the leading lines of these fallen trees still guide us on a second read towards our character. Fernström also has some really cool quarantine zone concept sketches here, which are a lot looser but still really fun to look at. I love the almost traditional tactile feel of these. They almost look like a marker on paper. But my favorite pieces from Fernström's posts are these concept paintings for the pinwheel. These paintings remind me a lot of the early moon concepts that Bungie did way back in like the 2010s. There's a great desolate mood in this first painting, which I think they eventually move away from, adding a lot more color, vibrance, and intensity in this other pass. And then all of that gets balanced out in our final pass here. The scene feels more fantastical and serene. This pinwheel environment is next cleaned up by a character, an outsourced studio that Bungie works with, before eventually getting finished up by Dima Goyainov, who turns these early sketches to one of the most visually striking 3D environments I think I've ever seen. The last bit of art that we'll go through here is some of the work that was done by West Studios, another amazing outsourced team that created a lot of these amazing stylized concepts for the environments of Marathon. There's a lot of really clear Alberto Mielgo inspiration in the texture work and the paint strokes that we can see in a lot of these environmental concepts, which are combined with these bold color relationships and graphic compositions to amplify and emphasize Bungie's graphic realism that they've tried to incorporate into every aspect of these environments. What an amazing art blast. Everything that we've shown today and all the projects that we've looked at don't come even close to encompassing all of the artists that worked on the team. So there's definitely the potential of a part 2. I'm certainly not done raving about Marathon's phenomenal art direction. Let me know if I missed an artist that you really wanted me to talk about, or if there's something in the artist that I showed that you noticed that I missed. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down below. Let me know what your favorite artwork was, who your favorite artist in the series is. A lot of the artists that are part of this art blast are still in the process of posting their artworks. Some of the artworks that I showed were literally posted as I was editing this video, so if you're a Bungie artist who worked on Marathon, get your projects out there. There are so many amazing artists on the Marathon team, on the Bungie team, and I can't wait to see what they create next. In any case, thank you all for watching to the end, and I will see you all next time.